Well, it feels like for the longest time, the A's have maintained that their closer, Mason Miller, just isn't available at the trade market. But it seems like maybe their mentality has shifted a little bit over the last couple of weeks. Is Mason Miller truly available? And what would it cost for a team to acquire the all-star closer? Let's talk about it next, right here on the PHLY Phillies podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the PHLY Phillies podcast. Tyler Zula here as the trade deadline is just over a week away. It seems like names are starting to come to the forefront to determine who actually is available and what is more smoke and mirrors to try to get other players and other teams to pay more and to give up more prospects for good players on the selling type of teams. Now, the Athletics are clearly sellers at this point, something that I didn't necessarily expect to happen at the beginning of the season. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I thought that the A's were going to be a world-class team or a championship level team, but it did feel like for a lot of people, they went out and spent some money, brought in Luis Severino, locked up Brent Rooker to a long-term deal. It felt like maybe this was the turning point a little bit for the A's, but they find themselves now 18 games under 500 at 42-60, 17 games back of the Astros in the American League West, and 12 games out of the final wild card spot in the American League. I've long maintained that it felt like this might be a turning point for the team and they were going to hold on to a lot of their core. Now, I think the players that they wouldn't move on from, namely Jacob Wilson, Brent Rooker, Lawrence Butler, Nick Kurtz, Tyler Soderstrom, Shea Langoliers, and of course, Mason Miller. Now, I think maybe that thought process has changed just a little bit over the last couple of weeks. And in fact, Ken Rosenthal has pointed out in the last week or so that maybe the thought process is going to change. This comes from Ken Rosenthal's piece just a couple of days ago. I'll read it for you verbatim, and then we'll talk about it. The way that the A's see it, only a few teams are bold enough to propose an offer for Miller worthy of consideration. General manager David Forst might engage those teams as the deadline nears, but for now, he appears willing to let them grow more desperate. Rosenthal continued and said this in the article on top of it: which teams might tempt the A's? The Philadelphia Phillies, who reached agreement Sunday with free agent reliever David Robertson, probably would be number one on the list. The LA Dodgers, with free agents Tanner Scott and Kirby Yates performing below expectations, almost certainly would be in the mix as well. So, with that being said, the Phillies clearly are in need of bullpen help. Even with the addition of David Robertson, they are still, in my estimation, an arm short heading into the trade deadline. That's become relatively obvious, even with the ascension of some younger arms, like perhaps Max Lazar. The Phillies need back end of the bullpen, high leverage help in a fairly bad way. Now, does that mean that Mason Miller is available? Well, I think, again, it felt like he wouldn't be at the beginning of the season, but as the trade deadline gets closer, the A's find themselves in further and further outside of contention than what maybe one would have expected. They've won just 5 of their last 16 series dating back to the beginning of May, and at one point from May 14th to June 1st had lost 21 of 23 games. Now, I personally still don't think that Miller gets moved at the trade deadline. I think the A's are going to ask for the world, and rightfully so. But a door that felt like it was once not only slammed shut, but also probably locked a few times over, now is cracked open just enough for opposite GMs to maybe start asking the questions. Now, before we get into what Mason Miller would command in the trade market, let's take a look at his numbers from this season. The first thing that's going to jump out to a lot of people is the ERA. It's a 4 ERA over 36 appearances. Now, let me tell you why I don't think that's as bad of a number as it may seem. Mason Miller gave up 5 earned runs in just 2/3 of an innings pitched to the Miami Marlins back on May 5th. If you take just that one game out of the conversation, his ERA drops from 4 to 2.8 on the season. And of course, you can take a look at his numbers here. 36 innings pitched. He is a 1-inning guy. 57 strikeouts over 36 innings. The walks are a little bit concerning for the this year. He's been really in the bottom 10 percentile of walks for most of the season, 17 walks in the 36 innings pitched, but the strikeout rates are through the roof. And the walks are really the reason as to why his whip is above 1, because he's only surrendered 21 hits over 36 innings pitched. But even with those 17 walks, his whip is just above 1 at 1.056. Now, you see on his Baseball Savant page, there's a lot of red. Whether it be in fastball velocity, you know this guy can bring it. Whether it be in chase rates, whiff rates, strikeout rates, he's great across the board. Fastball slider combo with unhittable stuff on both of those pitches. And his average exit velocity has been really good so far this year. He's in the 87th percentile, giving up an average exit velocity less than 88 miles an hour. Now, the one thing, as we said, that he's struggling with this year is his walk rate. Last year, he walked 21 hitters over the course of the season. This year, he's already at 17 in 29 less innings pitched. Now, the strikeout numbers, they're not as dramatic as 2024, but they're still really, really good. Last year, he had 104 strikeouts in 65 innings pitched, which is just absolutely absurd. They're video game disgusting type of numbers, but he's still at well over a strikeout per inning pitched, as you can see by the 57 over his 36 innings. But the one thing that he is doing still consistently well is that the strikeout rate is still at nearly 40%, which is less than a 2% dip from a year ago when he was at 42%. And his whiff rates are actually better this year at almost 43% than they were a year ago when they were at about 41%. Now, the fastball has been good. The slider's been just as dominant as it was a season ago. This year, righties are hitting 125 off the slider, have struck out 21 times, and have over a 53% whiff rate. And he's been also equally good against lefties with the slider. They're hitting just 100 on the slider this season with a 51% whiff rate. So if you're looking at the ERA, you're immediately going to say the 4 ERA seems really high for a guy that's going to command a high price in the trade market, and for a guy that is considered one of the best closers in all of baseball. But I think the ERA is super deceiving when it comes to Mason Miller specifically, because it's really just a handful of appearances. And really, you could think about just the one against the Miami Marlins, the blow up where he gave up 5 2/3 of an inning, that have really kind of doomed his ERA, because otherwise he'd be below 3 and nobody would bat an eye at that number. So Mason Miller is still an elite closer. There is no question about it. Fastball has life. Slider has wipeout ability. The strikeout numbers are there. The walks are certainly a little bit concerning, but outside of the walks, everything in the expected numbers is going in the right direction. The metrics are good. The whiff rates are good. The strikeout rates are good. So with all of that being said, the question is, what is the return? What is the value that the Athletics are going to look for Mason Miller at the deadline? So what we did was go back and take a look at some of the moves that were made at the trade deadline over the last 2 seasons. And I think the big one in the last 2 years is the San Diego Padres last year acquiring Tanner Scott at the deadline from the Miami Marlins. And of course, they also got another arm in the deal as well. But the Marlins received at the time the Padres number 2, number 4, number 5, and number 24 prospects. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Brian Hoeing is a nobody, but the deal was really to go get Tanner Scott. They gave up 3 top 5 prospects and 4 top 25 prospects as a whole. That's the big one that happened last season. But there was another fairly sizable one that happened last season as well. The Royals acquired Lucas Erceg from the A's in exchange for their 4th overall prospect and their 18th overall prospect and a 3rd prospect in the deal as well. We talked about it a lot over the last couple of weeks. Relievers have gone for a lot in terms of prospect return at the trade deadline over the last 2 seasons. Think about the 2023 season. We can go back to when the Texas Rangers acquired Aroldis Chapman from the Kansas City Royals. Who did they give up in exchange? Cole Reagans, who's been excellent since joining the Royals. And you can even think about some smaller deals like Pierce Johnson going from the Rockies to the Braves. The Rockies ended up getting Victor Vodnik, the Braves' 10th prospect, and Tanner Gordon, their 26th prospect, in exchange. And those are some smaller deals that have happened over the last couple of years. And then, of course, again, you add in the Chapman deal, you add in the Erceg deal, and of course, you add in the Tanner Scott deal. Now, what's the difference between the rest of these guys that we just mentioned and Mason Miller? Well, it's the years of team control and the relative youth of Mason Miller. Tanner Scott was a rental at the end of the season, and Tanner Scott didn't re-sign with the Padres. He ended up signing with the LA Dodgers this offseason. They gave up 4 top 25 prospects for a half a season of Tanner Scott. Mason Miller, meanwhile, still has 4 years of arbitration before becoming an unrestricted free agent in 2030. So you're going to have incredible amount of team control, and that is going to continue to bolster the return for Mason Miller should he get moved. Now, the question is, do the Phillies have enough to pull off this type of move? I think the answer is yes, but comparably, especially to the LA Dodgers, I do think the Phillies would end up having to give up more in exchange for Mason Miller than perhaps the Dodgers would. If you want to compare the two farm systems, especially comparing the Phillies and the Dodgers, it's not going to get you super excited. The Dodgers were the preseason ranked number 4 farm system. The Phillies were the 17th. Now, I will say midway through this season, the Phillies have been considered risers with a lot of love going to both Eduardo Taillé and to Aaron Escobar. And I think there is some favor starting to be generated with the two young guys that they've drafted over the last 2 years in Dante Nori and Griffin Burkholder. But I still do think if the Phillies are going to compete with the LA Dodgers for Mason Miller, they're going to end up having to give up more in terms of quantity of prospects because of the quality of prospects that the Dodgers have. First and foremost, do they want to move Dalton Rushing, who has played in the big leagues this year? I'm not sure that they do, but that name could be thrown in the conversation if the Dodgers are looking to sell out to go get Mason Miller. They also offer the 38th and 65th prospects in the top 100 in Alex Freeland and Jackson Ferris as well, which I think would be really enticing pieces for the A's in this conversation. So if the Phillies are going to get into the Mason Miller sweepstakes, it's going to cost the Phillies quite a bit. No matter what you think about the ERA this year, the Phillies are going to have to pony up and do it in a pretty significant way to acquire Mason Miller. At the end of the day, I still don't think that Mason Miller gets moved. And if he does, it's going to be for the moon, the stars, and everything else in the galaxy. And rightfully so, because Mason Miller is that dude. And I think when it comes to what the ask is going to be, the Phillies may eventually balk at the return on investment for Mason Miller, because I think you're looking at multiple top 5 prospects, just like in the Tanner Scott deal, plus more. And I'm not sure if the Phillies all at once are going to be in the conversation or will have the firepower to keep up with a team like the LA Dodgers.